I am not part of the UT group, so I think I'm the second person who comes from a different place. But I think what I want to try and show you through sort of my professional biography, that being in the research world in a research university is not a straight and narrow path where you do one thing and that's all you do. So what I'm going to tell you is the stuff I didn't know before and how I, in the course of my career thus far, have ended up creating a career that combines lots of stuff that is entrepreneurial, involves consulting stuff, lots of stuff that is basic research, and also other things that I didn't think I would be doing. But it took a while to get there. So I guess the beginning of it is to say that I'm a professor in the psychology and psychological and brain sciences department at UMass Amherst. So most of my time is spent doing the stuff that you probably see your advisors doing, research, teaching, and service. But that's 70% of my time. But the remaining 30% of my time, what I end up doing is I'm the director of faculty equity for the College of Natural Sciences. And as part of that, I use evidence-based, essentially social psychological and management science data to develop programs and practices and policies that will increase the number of underrepresented faculty and women in STEM fields, so in science, technology, and engineering fields. So essentially, I'm doing both. I'm doing the research end, and I'm also using the research I do and other people have done, and then developing programs to change the institution. So that's 30%. So the director of faculty equity is 30% of my time. The sort of being a professor is 70% of my time, but really it's quite fluid. It sort of depends on the week. So some of the stuff I do is like I said, is on the research end. The teaching that I do is less classroom teaching these days. A lot of it is mentoring graduate students, it's mentoring postdocs, and it's mentoring assistant professors. So a lot of my teaching work is not what it used to be 10 years ago. It's much more mentoring. And I'll talk about it at the end. I do a lot of sort of consulting and entrepreneur of ideas sort of stuff, which I'll get to later. So somebody said this in the earlier talks, and I want to echo this. I think Cindy said this, that I totally agree that my mantra is that the profession we are in is a marathon, not a sprint. And that's important to remember because the goals you set for yourself and the way not to get too stressed out about it is to think in 5-year chunks rather than in 1 or 2 year chunks. So straight from graduate school, and certainly now, I think, where do I want to be 5 years from now? And where do I want to be 10 years from now, instead of where do I want to be by the end of this year. The 5-year chunk is something that's easier to imagine, and it's less stressful than 1 year. And I'll show you how that played out in my career. So I started off, it may seem from the outside in a very straightforward undergrad to PhD to postdoc to job. But inside my head, that's not how it felt. I started off as a biology major and had never taken psychology in high school, took a psychology course, 2 psychology courses, as part of a liberal arts curriculum, and just got hooked, really got hooked. I loved the fact that it was trying to understand human behavior through doing science, not through opinion, not through creative writing, although both of those are important, but it was using the scientific methodology to figure out how the human mind works. I really loved that. So I ended up changing to a psychology and neuroscience major, and that's what I ended up majoring in. And my original interest in doing a psych and neuroscience major, but especially the psychology end of it, is that I was interested in the problem of inequality. So no matter where in the world I had been and I had gone, there were always some group-based inequalities. I was interested in where they came from, why they were so intractable and hard to change, and what were the things that made that actually led to change. What made social structures change, what made individuals change their behavior. So this was sort of the big question, the big thing that I wanted to understand and have an impact on. And the way I wanted to do that is by using science. So if you put those two things together, an interest in social inequality and using scientific methodology, especially sort of experimental methodology and then field studies and so on, but especially experiments, I liked the neatness of cause and effect. It seems that the obvious thing to do was to go for a PhD in social psychology. So that's what I did. I went to Yale and got my PhD in Yale, but that sentence, again, sounds much neater than it actually was. The first thing, so I should say, at Yale I worked with two people, Bob Abelson and Mahzarin Banaji. And they were two very different in terms of style, in terms of their approach to research, the stage of career. Bob was close to retirement. Mahzarin was an assistant professor. They thought differently, but I learned a lot from them because of their differences, which I think is an important thing, that each advisor has a very different advising style. The first thing I realized is the huge chasm between the big question I was interested in, social inequality, and the way basic research, basic science worked in experimental social psychology. And that chasm was really enormous, and I think I didn't, coming into a PhD program as a 22-year-old, didn't quite understand it the way I did in that first year in New Haven. Where I realized that experimental methods were somewhere here, the problem I was trying to solve or trying to understand was somewhere there, and I couldn't see how I would get from here to there. So I spent, so I was interested in macro questions, and the methods I was using was micro. So I spent the first 3 years questioning, especially the first 2 years, questioning whether a PhD in social was the right path for me. I considered lots of things. I considered leaving and joining and applying for a policy program. I considered working for an NGO. I considered going into marketing research. I considered working for a grassroots organization. I did all of that. I thought maybe I should have at least something to show for it and get a master's degree, and then I could go and do something else. Or maybe I could get a PhD and then go into a non-academic path. So I considered all of that, and every year I gave myself permission to go the next year until I was sure about where I wanted to be. And so the first 3 years, that's sort of what I did, trying to figure out whether this PhD thing was the right fit for me. And somewhere in my 4th year, it clicked. I got it. I got a few different things. I got the fact that I understood what a good question was, why it was important to establish a cause and effect relationship, why it was important to understand what was the sort of the process that led the cause to the effect, why it was important to rule out alternative explanations that could explain the same covariation, and why all of this stuff needed to happen before I got to testing these ideas in the messy real world, and before I got from the messy real world to interventions that could actually turn into social change. So I realized that in order to get to that social change, if I wanted to really have it be based on evidence, I had to decide whether I wanted to generate that evidence. And I think my realization was that I liked generating the evidence. I liked the process of doing science. And I think if it had been the end goal that was the only driver, I would have probably left Yale. But it was not the only goal. I think the process of doing the science was very satisfying. And what I had to realize is that I had to be willing to delay gratification. This is sort of what I was telling our table at the back, that the goal was not to get to the field research, the applications, the interventions, the policy change today, or straight out of a PhD program. That was just not feasible, not if I wanted to do the research. My goal was to see if I could set myself up 10 years later to get there and to make the change I wanted to make. So and that was sort of what I had to make peace with. Could I wait 10 years and do the work, establish the credibility, and get out there and say, this is the change you should make. This works, this doesn't. This feels good, but it doesn't do anything. This really works. And then talk to the people who, in the institutions where I wanted to have some impact. And then so coming to the realization that I was willing to delay gratification for me was huge. That's when I knew I wanted to go into a research career. The next obstacle was that comes later, getting comfortable with, which is where I think a lot of you may be, getting comfortable with the uncertainty of knowing where you're going to end up. It's the uncertainty, so all of us in some way has a need for closure to one degree or another, and getting used to the discomfort of not knowing where you'll end up is tough. So just to back up one bullet point, what really helped me sort of figure out my path and to figure out the timeline was excellent mentoring. That made all the difference. And mentoring from two sources, I would say. One, from the graduate students who were ahead of me, who were 2 through 5 years ahead of me. They made a huge difference. So the culture in the program at that time were that people would hang out there often. All grad students worked from that Kirtland Hall where we all worked. The faculty were there often. All our offices were in the same place. So there was a lot of mutual mentoring there from student to student, which was really helpful. And then, very critically, was my graduate advisor, I think, whose mentoring was very useful in thinking about the big picture, where I wanted to go, how to write well, how to write for different audiences that were not just pitched to JPSB. So I think the mentoring helped me stick it out and figure it out. But then I also had to resolve the questions about what I came to graduate school for, and whether I was willing to wait for that and set myself up into the future. Once I came close to graduating, so I'm talking 1997, the best thing that happened to me is that I didn't get a job. Instead, I got a postdoc. I got a postdoc working with Tony Greenwald at the University of Washington, who I didn't know at all. And he had a reputation, shall we say. And so it was not clear whether we would click, but it was fantastic that I actually took the risk for a couple of reasons. One is I was sort of burnt out on my own PhD, my dissertation research. I was sick of it, it was done, the paper was published, I really wanted to switch, but I don't think I had formed the idea in my head. But Tony was just getting going on his research on implicit bias, he and Mazreen, and it was the right time for me to figure out if that's what I wanted to do. And I just spent a lot of time in the psych department in Seattle, just reading the stuff, running pilot studies on myself, and just getting familiar with it. And one of the things, so this is the research on implicit bias, and one of the things I realized is that I didn't agree with the status quo of the field at that time. So the status quo of implicit bias work at that time that people like Trish Devine was writing about, Tony and Mazreen were writing about, John Barge was writing about, was the idea that these implicit attitudes develop very early in life, and once they develop, they're very hard to change. You can persuade people in change their conscious, explicit attitudes, but you cannot quite easily change their implicit attitudes. That didn't strike me as being true. Partly it didn't strike me as being true because when I did my little experiments on myself, I tried to imagine my friends who were not of my own race. I tried to imagine other people before I did a race IET, for example. And it felt to me that my responses were different. I didn't know for sure, but that's what it seemed like. So I think I convinced Tony that implicit bias was actually malleable, that the reason it seemed fixed and stable to us is because we would always measure it in the same situation. We would bring people into the lab in a very sterile environment, and we would measure their attitudes, and so we got great reliability over time. But that if we changed the situation, my intuition was that the attitudes and the associations we would capture would be different. So what we were capturing, the stability we were capturing, was the stability of someone's environment, who they were hanging out with, who their friends were, who they were going to school with, who their coworkers were. And if you change that environment, you would change the implicit attitude. So Tony initially didn't buy it. But then over drinks one day at a party, we had a bet. And he said, it's not going to work. And I said, at least let me do the experiment. And if it doesn't work, then you can say, I told you so. So he said, all right, $5 bet. So we had a $5 bet. He said, it won't change. And I said, I think it will, but $5, I can do that. So we had the bet. I did the experiment. We brought people back into the lab 24 hours later. And before they did, we measured implicit racial attitudes. Before we did it, we had them, showed them these pictures and biographies of admired famous African Americans in one study. In another study, it was in a different study at a different time on sexual orientation. It was people who were sexual minorities who were well-liked and admired and out. Or in the control condition, we showed them nothing. And we found that implicit bias effects on race, age, sexual orientation became significantly smaller when you changed that context than when you left the context the same. We brought people back into the lab 24 hours later, and it was still there. So Tony lost the bet. We got a JPSV paper out of it, and the path of my career had completely changed, because it wasn't the research I had started with, but it completely galvanized me. And I think that paper, in some ways, and that postdoc, I think more importantly, set me on a trajectory that would have been very different than the trajectory I would have gotten if I had got a tenure-track job or whatever straight out of my PhD. So I think small things that you think of at the time as being not so good, how can I be a nomad in Seattle when I don't know anybody for 2 years, ended up in retrospect, to be really an asset, not a liability. All right. So then I moved from Seattle to my first job in New York as an assistant professor at the New School for Social Research, which, if you don't know, is built on a very European model, which is to say it's a standalone graduate faculty. It's a PhD granting institution for the social sciences only. It doesn't have natural sciences. It was loosely affiliated with an undergraduate college, but its primary intention was to train PhDs in the social sciences. So it's very different from the American university model, but it's a very European model. I loved the place for a few different reasons. I had colleagues who were incredibly smart and interesting. I was in Manhattan. I was doing the research I wanted to. I was being my own boss. Nobody told me what question to pursue. Nobody told me you should be doing this or you should be doing that. I did whatever the heck I wanted, which was really fun. But the downside of the New School is that it was not an institution set up for quantitative research. So more of the people were qualitative researchers. Some were quantitative, but it was a minority. Also, it didn't have the big research infrastructure you need to do research and have internal money available to do research. But again, this is another example of something where an obstacle turned into an asset. So what I quickly realized that I would burn out through my startup funds very quickly unless I figured out a way to get funds. And so I was at the New School for 3 years, and in those 3 years, I wrote 4 grants. Because I had to, not because I wanted to, but because I had to in order to do the work I wanted and in order to sort of see my career trajectory. Remember, I was on a 5-year plan. So I wanted to be where I wanted to be in 5 years, and I knew that the money would run out, and I knew I had to attract the funds. So I applied for an NSF, I applied for an NIH, I applied for 2 private foundation grants, and I'll say more about this in the next slide, with no idea if it would fly. But it actually worked. And over the 3 years, I got 4 grants. But it wasn't, part of it was figuring out the system. And that's sort of what I want to share with you, because I think if you can figure out the granting system, you can actually get it. But you have to get your mindset to be a defensive pessimist, where you put your idea out there, you hope you get it, but you assume that in the first cycle, chances are you won't get it. Chances are you'll have to revise and resubmit. And you have to be sort of zen about and okay with it. And so let me tell you the sort of things that I did. So in the process, once I sort of had got the grants, got some more papers out, I knew that the new school in the long run was not a good fit for me, because I wanted to be, now I was sort of fully invested in a research career, and I knew where I wanted to go with more clarity. So I applied, and I got the job at UMass, which is where I've been for the past 11-ish years. So this is what I did to get grants, and I think initially I did it by accident, but I now know this is the formula that's worked for me. So if this is the path you're on, please try it. The first thing is you have to gather examples of grants that other people have got, preferably people in your own career stage. So I got grant proposals that had been funded, one from NIH, one from NSF, from friends of mine who were 2 or 3 or 4 years senior than me. And getting their grants allowed me to see essentially how they pitched their research, what the frame was, how much detail they gave, how much was enough and not too much, how they wrote, the balance between jargon and not jargon. All of that was very useful. People can describe it to you in words, but it's much better to actually see the guts of a grant proposal. So that was, I think, point number one, which I think helped get me funded. The second is to develop your own research questions that you're interested in, and then to make it sharp, not to make it in a way that is easily, clearly testable. It has a clear cause, a clear effect, and then subsequent questions have the whys and whens and all of the moderation, mediation sort of questions. But then the key thing on this point is you need pilot data. It is impossible or virtually impossible to get funded on your first grant or your second grant if you don't have the data to convince the funder, whether it's a private or a public funder, that they should give you $200,000 if they don't know whether you can deliver on it. So you need some initial pilot data. So those pilot data might be a previous article you wrote. So that's your initial data on which you're basing your follow-up research. It might be a small pilot you ran at your university. Might be a correlational study or an experiment. You need some pilot data to show that you're onto something. And it's not a pie-in-the-sky idea where it's not clear that it would work out. So the pilot data is key. The third thing that I would highly recommend, this sort of was something that, again, came up in another talk, is present your ideas in all forums that you can, in internal talks, your own university brown bags, in conference talks, in data blitzes, wherever you can, in somebody else's lab as a guest visitor or whatever, and invite criticism. Invite people to poke holes at your ideas and tell you where the weaknesses are. It's better that it come from somebody you know who can help you anticipate, develop your arguments, collect the data to rule it out, than to get it once you've put in a huge amount of work and written a grant proposal that then you need to now revise 6 months later. So the whole idea of presenting and getting criticism is really to help you sharpen your ideas. And I did a lot of that in the first 3 years. Allow plenty of time to write your proposal, revise and revise and revise. I can tell you that when I write grant proposals and I sort of label them by the date and I create a new version if I've made a substantial change, I easily go through 10 dated versions until I think it's ready to go out. I do the same thing for papers. But the point of this here is that when you first write a grant proposal, until you get the script, it takes a while to figure out how to write, how to pitch it. It's more than a paper, but it's hypothetical. So I would say give yourself a semester to write the proposal, and then get feedback from a few trusted colleagues. These should ideally be colleagues who themselves have been funded, because they know what it'll take. And these should also be people whose feedback you trust, meaning you know that they won't just say good stuff, that they will tell you, this is good, this is not working, or I don't understand the logic here, or I don't understand the language here, or whatever it is. So invite feedback from trusted colleagues. One of the things I did early on for my first couple of federal grants is I wrote to a few people, my previous mentors, and I said, I'm writing this proposal. Could you give me some feedback? How long do you think it would take you? How long should I give you so that I'm not asking you for something that's too onerous? And then based on how long they said it would take them, let's say they said it'll take them 3 weeks, I then made sure I sent them something. I timed my emails so that I would get something back from them with enough time for me to revise. And that was actually key. So if I solicited feedback, but I knew I had no time to revise, then what's the point? So that's the other thing. This point is important. Assume you submit it after being the cheerleader for your grant or for your proposal. But you, after it goes out, distract yourself with your other stuff that's on your plate and assume chances are you'll have to revise and resubmit. Just assume it. If it gets funded, great. But if you assume it's not going to get funded and it doesn't, your assumption, your expectation and the reality is aligned. It's not as disappointing. Don't take rejection personally. Put some space. It's not a rejection of you as a person. It's basically saying the idea needs more work, or we didn't have enough money. We funded the top 5 proposals and then we ran out of money. It doesn't mean they don't like you. It doesn't mean the funder doesn't think you're smart. So put some distance between your self-worth and a rejection from a funder or a paper. I'm not saying it's easy. It still isn't easy for me. So I usually look at the bottom line and then I put it away for a few weeks. And then I go back to it and then I read the reviews. When I'm sort of more accustomed to, all right, it's been rejected, now what is it that they want? And typically, most reviewers, I say this for papers and for grant proposals, will give feedback that will make the product better. Very, very rarely is it the case that somebody will say something that either doesn't make sense at all, or is something that's very personal and is sort of off the mark. Most of the times, reviewers will say something that will help me sharpen my idea. And I see that as a positive thing. And I try to get that when I present my idea so I can sort of inoculate the proposal before it goes in. But sometimes people raise things that you didn't anticipate or that somebody else didn't raise before. And so the reviews are really important. And so then I use the criticism to strengthen my proposal. So I can tell you that even though my first 4 grants got funded, one of them I went in asking for 2 years of funding, 3 years of funding, they gave me 1. That was my first NSF grant. The other, I asked for $30,000. They said, show us some pilot data, we'll give you 6. We'll give you 6,000. Bring us some pilot data and then apply for the 30,000. So I did the pilot study, that was Foundation Grant 1, and then I went back when the study worked for the whole 30,000, and then I got that second one. So sometimes you get your foot in the door, and then you open the door a little bit more every time. And once you start getting grants, it's easier to keep getting them, because then you have a reputation, people sort of know your stuff, and you know the language. You know the language you need to speak in order to sell your ideas. Okay. So life now is actually quite different from where my professional life started. So I feel totally expansive and free. I have no more hoops to jump through. So post-tenure, post-associate at full. But more interestingly, I think it frees me up to do different kinds of research. So I still do a lot of basic experimental social psych research, but I also do a lot of field research these days, trying to test interventions that change implicit bias, sometimes decreasing it. But I also do studies to look at when bias gets magnified. So sometimes I do research on implicit bias and aggression using video games and shooter games to test out measures of aggression. Who do people shoot? Do they shoot to kill? Do they shoot to injure? I do a lot of work on educational disparities for girls and women in STEM. So this whole thing of technical women in science and technology, in academic science and in industry is a big part of my research. And through all of the work I've done since '97 to now, I do a lot of consulting work. So I'm sort of coming to consulting, coming to non-academic stuff, 15, 16 years post-PhD. So I consult with K-12 schools, I consult with colleges and universities, I talk to provosts and chancellors and deans about diversity in academia in general, but particularly in STEM fields. I sit on advisory boards of think tanks. I also sometimes consult for nonprofit groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, like other sort of teaching groups. I give talks to legal scholars, to judges, to people who do impact litigation on the defendant side for people who've been let go and they think it's because of employment bias. I've recently started going to Capitol Hill to give talks about what policymakers should fund to increase the numbers of girls and underrepresented minorities in STEM fields, because federal government gives money to the states then develop programs. I'm trying to do the same now, to talk to businesses, tech businesses. So I've been much more on the think tank side and on the nonprofit side and on the legal side than I have been on the tech businesses side. So that's sort of one of the places I'm going to now. So basically, I see my applied work, both the field research and the consulting work, as taking the lab research I've done with my students and then applying it to figure out what the problems are and what the solutions are for inequities in education, employment, legal justice system, and so on. So I collaborate with some law professors at UCLA and UC Hastings. They do the legal writing, I do the social psychological writing. I actually think, contrary to the more pessimistic perception before, that social psychology is having a huge impact, much more than it did in the 90s. So part of it may be where I saw the field when I first entered it. But part of it is what it's called. It's not always called social psychology. Sometimes it's called mind sciences. Sometimes it's called behavioral sciences. It may be called some other kind of science. But the point is that the message of our work does get out. It may not always be called social psychology. If you read the New York Times science section, almost at least once a month, it'll be something that has to do with social psychology. Sometimes written by a social psychologist, sometimes written by somebody else, but that's presenting social psych work. I spend a lot of time, as I said, mentoring grad students, my couple of postdocs, and mentoring pre-tenure faculty a lot. I have a lab. I wrote large, but I actually think it's sort of the right size for me. So I have 3 graduate students, 2 postdocs, a project manager, and then a much larger pool of undergraduate research assistants. So the place in my career that I am is I do the idea development. I think about what is the next step based on what I'm hearing from practitioners, based on what I think is important from the science end, and then I write the grants. And then my graduate students and my postdocs do the writing and get first authorship. And sort of the rule in my lab typically is for the person who does the majority of the writing and the data analysis, they should get to be the first author of the paper. So it may be a grant that I brought in, but I don't need to be first author on it. It's much more important for me to see the work get out there. So that's sort of what I do. So I sort of work on the big ideas part because I don't have the time to be analyzing my own data, and I think it's time for me to sort of train my students to focus on that. And finally, I'll say I don't see myself as having done it all, because I know things always change. There are always new challenges. There are always new things you want to do. There are always new opportunities. So as I started before, I'll say that I think of life in 5-year chunks. So in the next 5 years, I might be sort of doing a little bit less of something and doing a little bit more of something else. And I think that's the freedom that academia brings you. You just have to think of it in terms of the long haul. So I know I'm out of time. Here are the takeaways. One, there's no one path to a research career. So I know it may feel that way if you're a graduate student, that you have to get that job straight out, and that's the narrow thing you do. But that's not really how it is. You can create your own path. Uncertainty and self-doubt is normal. I've experienced it. I'm sure most, if not all of you have experienced it. Everybody who will be here tomorrow has experienced it. You may not see it, but they've experienced it. It's part of the game. The main question to ask is, do you love the work you do? Is this intrinsically motivating to you? If you didn't get any rewards for it, would you still do it? If the answer is yes, yes, and yes, then do it. If you feel that one of these is not true for you, then think of other things that you love better. Accept criticism as a way to improve. Don't be defensive. It's the best way to become better, to invite criticism and to be able to give people criticism in a constructive way. Instead of having all our interactions with each other be just feel good, it should be, the whole point of science is peer review, both in writing and interpersonally. And the goal is to make each other's work better. Social comparison. I find it's better to compare myself to my past self than to compare myself to other people. There will always be somebody who's doing better than you. It's not going to galvanize you. What might galvanize you more is to think of how you were 2 years ago and how much you've changed in 2 years. And finally, take the long view. Instead of thinking about it in 1 year, think in 5-year terms. And try to think where you want to get, and do the little things that will get you closer to your goal. So that's all I had, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, whatever. Oh, okay. Yes, Liz.
So we heard some of the speakers earlier talk about, some of the things that they liked about going the non-academic route, as far as, the politics and, that kind of stuff. And I'm curious how you sort of stayed above that, or, how that not affect how much you love your work.
Politics within a department?
Or within publishing, or students getting jobs, or just some of the other things that were touched on.
So I think politics is always there in anywhere you have human beings. So there's always social comparison, there's always some competitiveness and jousting. But you can also choose to go, if you have a choice, choose programs that are more collegial than more competitive. I think the places I've ended up being have been, by and large, very collegial places. And I've gone to give brown bags at other places and realized once I was in there that people were deeply unhappy because it was so competitive and cutthroat. So partly it's choosing places where people like each other and are happy to see. So what I call the lunch factor. Do I want to have lunch with my colleagues? If the lunch factor is a yes, then that's a good place to be. If the lunch factor is no, I want to go in and close my office door, that's not a place where I would want to be in the long run. Yeah, so I think politics is some things it's about choosing the right place. I don't know how to say this, I try to stay out of gossip. Let me put it this way. So if I hear something about something, I either try to walk away from it or not participate in it in any way. And by doing so, keep some space between that. But mostly find the people you like hanging out with and who share your values, who do the work you want to do, and spend more time with them, and then the rest of the stuff will just fall away or it won't matter. It's easier to do in big departments. It's harder to do, the smaller the department, the more cliquish it can get, actually, and sometimes. All right.
For the things that you do in terms of consulting and faculty equity, are those things that you went ahead and put together, or
good question.
people contact you? How do you choose which ones you do and don't do?
That's a very good question, actually. We were talking about it at our table earlier. So a lot of the consulting work initially came to me. Okay, so I think some of it may have come to me by reference. So somebody may have asked Tony or Mazreen to give a talk, and it either wasn't their work or they couldn't do it, and they referred the person to me. So some of it was your graduate and postdoc advisors opening doors for you. Some of it was stuff that once I started giving a few of those talks, then people got to know me, and then they would give me their business cards, I would give them my business card, and then they'd say, you'll be hearing from us, we wonder if you can come to this organization and give this type of talk. So some of it was like that. And it started when I was an assistant professor, so I didn't have to wait till post-tenure to get my work out. But I'll also say that now I say yes to the consulting things that I think will in some way benefit my research goals and benefit my sort of social justice values. And there are other things I will say no to. So I'm much more likely to say no to a brown bag and say yes to speaking to a group of employment discrimination lawyers, or to say yes to going on Capitol Hill, or to say yes to speaking to a K-12 group of principals and science teachers and stuff like that. So now I say yes more carefully. But initially, I would say yes to any opportunity to speak to a non-academic audience. Okay, I know I'm out of time.